I opened our laptop and discovered my wife was secretly studying psychological manipulation to control me, until I turned the experiment against her. Changes everything? That's exactly what happened when I opened our shared laptop to check my email and saw her search history still logged in. What I found wasn't some innocent browsing about recipes or shopping deals. No. What I discovered was a digital roadmap to psychological warfare disguised as marriage advice. How to implement total control in marriage. Subtle manipulation techniques for husbands. Making your spouse dependent on your approval. Psychology tricks to change behavior without confrontation. The list went on, each search more calculating than the last. My coffee grew cold as I scrolled through weeks of research that painted a picture I'd been too blind to see. Suddenly, everything clicked into place, like pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know I was solving. Those times she'd casually mentioned how my friends were bad influences weren't random observations. The way she'd started questioning every decision I made, from what I ate for lunch to which route I took to work, wasn't loving concern. The subtle comments about how I never used to act this way whenever I showed independence weren't innocent remarks. She'd been studying me like a lab rat. I sat there staring at the screen, remembering how just last week she'd implemented what she called our new communication system. She wanted me to text her every hour during work to stay connected. When I'd hesitated, she made it sound like I was being unreasonable, like any loving husband would want to share every moment with his wife. Now I realized it wasn't about connection at all. It was about surveillance. The worst part? Some of these tactics were actually working. I'd started asking her opinion on things I used to decide independently. I'd begun avoiding certain friends because her subtle disapproval made it seem easier. I'd even started second-guessing my own preferences when she'd give me that look that said I was being difficult. But here's the thing about discovering you're being manipulated. Once you see the strings, you can't unsee them. Every conversation we'd had in recent months replayed in my mind. But this time, I could see the script she was following. The gaslighting disguised as concern, the guilt trips wrapped in loving language, the slow erosion of my autonomy presented as couples' growth. I heard her car pulling into the driveway and quickly closed the browser. She walked in with that smile that used to warm my heart, but now looked different, calculated. She kissed my cheek and asked about my day with the same tone someone might use to check on a pet. "How was work, honey? You seem tense. Did you remember to eat lunch at the right time?" Even that simple question now revealed its true nature. She wasn't asking because she cared about my nutrition. She was checking to see if I was following the routine she'd gradually established for me, the routine that kept me predictable and manageable. "Yeah, I ate," I replied, watching her face for signs of the manipulation I now knew was there. "Good. I worry when you don't take care of yourself properly. You know how you get when your blood sugar drops?" There was the subtle implication that I couldn't be trusted to manage my own basic needs, that I was somehow deficient without her guidance. A few months ago, I might have appreciated her concern. Now I recognized it as another tool in her expanding arsenal of control. She moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing dinner while casually asking about my interactions with co-workers, my plans for tomorrow, whether I'd spoken to any friends. Each question seemed innocent on the surface, but I now understood they were data collection points for her ongoing project of managing my life. "Oh, and I was thinking," she said, not looking up from chopping vegetables, "maybe we should start having a weekly planning session, to coordinate our schedules better, make sure we're on the same page about everything." Translation: another system to monitor and control my activities under the guise of organization. "Sure," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "That sounds reasonable." She looked pleased with my compliance, completely unaware that I'd just discovered her entire playbook. As I watched her continue her performance of the caring wife while mentally cataloging my responses for future manipulation, I realized something important. She thought she was winning a game I didn't even know we were playing. But now that I knew the rules, everything was about to change. The student was about to become the teacher, and class was about to begin. The next morning, she left for her yoga class with the same cheerful goodbye she'd been giving me for months. But this time, instead of heading straight to work, I decided to do some investigating of my own. If she was treating our marriage like a psychology experiment, I figured I should understand the full scope of her research. I started in her home office, a space I'd always respected as her private domain. Funny how respect works one way in a relationship built on manipulation. Her desk was meticulously organized, which should have been my first clue about her controlling nature. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. Behind her stack of work folders, I found what looked like a personal journal. The cover was innocent enough, but the contents read like a field manual for domestic psychological warfare. Page after page of notes about my behavior patterns, responses to different stimuli, and what she called optimization strategies. Day 12 of implementing approval withdrawal technique. One entry read, subject showed increased anxiety when I remained silent after he suggested dinner plans. Technique proving effective for establishing dependency on positive reinforcement. Then, an alarming thought. Subject. She was calling me a subject. Another entry detailed how she'd been gradually shifting my social connections, successfully created distance between subject and college friends by expressing concern about their influence. Subject now asks permission before making plans with them. Next phase, introduce replacement social circle that supports desired behavioral modifications. I flipped through weeks of these clinical observations, each one more disturbing than the last. She documented everything from my sleep patterns to my emotional responses to her various manipulation tactics. There were even graphs showing what she called my compliance trajectory over time. But the journal was just the beginning. Her browser bookmarks revealed an entire library of psychological manipulation resources, forums dedicated to relationship optimization, articles about training your partner's behavior, and video courses on subtle influence techniques for couples. Then I found her participation in an online community called Domestic Leadership Strategies. The name alone made my skin crawl. But her post there revealed the true extent of her project. She wasn't just manipulating me, she was sharing her methods with other women and celebrating her successes. Update on my long-term behavior modification project, one of her recent posts began. The subject is now seeking my approval for most decisions and has drastically reduced independent social activities. The key is patience and consistency. Small adjustments over time create major behavioral shifts without triggering resistance. The responses from other members were equally disturbing. Women congratulating her on her progress and asking for specific techniques. Some shared their own success stories about reshaping their husbands' personalities and life choices. One comment particularly caught my attention. Your approach inspired me to start my own project. 6 months in, and my husband now genuinely believes that most of his preferences were actually my suggestions that he adopted. The gaslighting component of your method is brilliant. My wife had responded with detailed advice about implementing what she called memory revision techniques and preference transplantation. I sat there reading post after post, watching my wife discuss me like I was a renovation project she was particularly proud of. She'd even shared before and after descriptions of my personality, treating my natural independence and confidence as problems that needed to be solved. The most recent post made my blood run cold. Phase 3 implementation beginning next week. Subject is now sufficiently conditioned for major lifestyle restructuring, planning to introduce financial dependency and career limitation strategies. The goal is complete integration of his identity with my preferences and objectives. Financial dependency, career limitations. She was planning to dismantle every aspect of my independence systematically. I photographed the most damning evidence with my phone, then carefully returned everything to its original position. As I prepared to leave for work, my mind was racing with the implications of what I discovered. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was a comprehensive plan to erase my identity and replace it with a version she designed. But here's what she didn't understand about her subject. I'd built a successful career by being analytical and strategic. Those same skills that made me effective in business were about to be turned toward a very different kind of problem solving. She thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. The truth was, I just realized we were playing chess, and I was about to study her playbook until I understood every move she'd been making. Every technique she'd used on me was about to become a tool I could recognize and counter. When she returned from yoga, glowing with the satisfaction of someone who believed their secret project was progressing perfectly, I greeted her with the same compliance she'd been conditioning me to display. But inside, I was already planning my next move. She had no idea that her experimental subject had just gained access to all her research notes. And unlike her approach of slow, subtle manipulation, I was about to demonstrate what decisive action actually looked like. The student had found the teacher's lesson plan, and class was about to take a very different direction. Knowledge is power, but strategic application of that knowledge is victory. Now that I understood exactly what game she was playing, I decided to let her think she was winning while I prepared my actual response. Sometimes, the best way to defeat a manipulator is to let them believe their manipulation is working perfectly. Over the next week, I became the ideal subject for her experiment. When she suggested I should probably skip my monthly poker night with the guys because it was getting expensive, I agreed immediately. When she recommended I start asking her opinion before making any purchases over $20, I thanked her for helping me become more financially responsible. Her journal entries during this period must have been filled with celebration. She was getting compliance faster than ever, and I could see the satisfaction in her eyes every time I demonstrated the exact behavior she was trying to condition. What she didn't realize was that I was documenting everything just as meticulously as she was. I'd started my own notebook, hidden in my car, where I recorded every manipulation attempt, every control tactic, and every psychological technique she employed. Unlike her clinical approach, mine was building toward a specific endpoint. I wasn't studying her behavior to modify it. I was gathering evidence for a reckoning. The breakthrough came when she introduced what she called our evening reflection sessions. Every night after dinner, we'd sit together, and she'd ask me to share my thoughts about the day, my interactions with people, and my plans for tomorrow. She presented it as quality time for deeper connection, but I recognized it for what it really was: daily psychological debriefing sessions. "I love how open you're becoming," she said after one of these sessions where I'd perfectly played the role of the gradually controlled husband. "You're so much more thoughtful about things now, more considerate of how your actions affect us as a couple. Translation, you're finally becoming the compliant version of yourself that I've been engineering." But here's where her psychology training failed her. She was so focused on achieving compliance that she missed the signs that her subject was studying her back. Every technique she used, I observed and categorized. Every emotional manipulation I noted and learned to recognize. She was teaching me to be immune to her methods by showing me exactly how they worked. During this time, I also began quietly securing my independence. I opened a separate bank account that she didn't know about. I documented all our shared assets and debts. I researched my legal rights and consulted with an attorney about my options. While she was celebrating her psychological victory, I was building the foundation for my actual victory. The most revealing moment came when she decided to test her level of control by introducing what she called our new decision-making process. She wanted me to discuss every choice with her before acting, from what to wear to work to which grocery store to visit. She presented it as being more considerate and unified as a couple. "I think it's beautiful how couples can move as one unit," she explained, her eyes bright with the excitement of someone who believed they'd achieved total dominance. "When partners truly trust each other's judgment, they naturally want to coordinate everything." I nodded thoughtfully as if this made perfect sense. "You're right. I can see how that would make our relationship stronger." Her smile was radiant. In her mind, she'd successfully transformed an independent man into someone who couldn't function without her input. She had no idea that I was performing the role of the controlled husband while secretly preparing to demonstrate what actual independence looked like. The final test of her control came when she suggested I should probably find a new job closer to home. Not because my current position was problematic, but because she wanted me to have more time for us and less exposure to workplace relationships that might interfere with her project. "I've been thinking," she said over coffee one morning, "maybe it's time for you to consider that position at the local company we talked about. It would be such a better work-life balance for us." We'd never talked about any local position. She was inventing conversations to make her control seem like a mutual decision, but instead of challenging her obvious lie, I played along. "That's actually a really good point. I should probably start looking into opportunities closer to home." Her face lit up like she'd just won the lottery. In her mind, she'd successfully convinced me to limit my career prospects for the sake of her control project. She was so confident in her psychological dominance that she didn't notice I was taking notes on her reaction, studying her techniques, and preparing my counter-strategy. That night, she made another entry in her journal, probably documenting this latest success in her behavior modification experiment. But I was making entries in my own record, building a comprehensive case study of exactly how someone attempts to systematically destroy their partner's independence. She thought she was writing the final chapter of her control project. What she didn't realize was that I was writing the opening chapter of her education about what happens when you try to manipulate someone who's finally seen through your entire system. The puppet was about to cut his own strings, and the puppeteer was about to learn that some performances end with the actor walking off stage entirely. 3 weeks into my performance as the perfectly controlled husband, I began implementing changes that she'd never see coming. While she was busy celebrating her psychological achievements, I was quietly dismantling every avenue she could use to control me long-term. The financial independence came first. I redirected my direct deposit to the new account I'd opened, then set up automatic transfers to our joint account for exactly my half of the household expenses. Nothing more, nothing less. When she eventually discovered this change, it would be too late for her to claim financial entanglement as leverage. Next, I contacted the attorney again and began documenting everything properly, every manipulation attempt, every control tactic, every instance of her treating me like an experiment rather than a partner. The evidence was overwhelming, and my legal position was stronger than I'd initially thought. But the real masterpiece was watching her escalate her control attempts as she gained confidence. She'd become so convinced of her success that she started implementing increasingly bold strategies. Each one revealed more about her true intentions and gave me more ammunition for what was coming. The latest escalation came when she announced that she'd been doing research on healthy relationships and had some new ideas for us to try. She pulled out a printed article about couples' accountability systems and suggested we implement what she called mutual oversight protocols. "It's fascinating," she said, spreading the papers across our coffee table like she was presenting a business proposal. "Couples who practice complete transparency and shared decision-making report much higher satisfaction rates." I skimmed the article, noting immediately that she'd highlighted only the sections about oversight and monitoring while ignoring any parts about mutual respect or individual autonomy. Classic selective interpretation to support her agenda. "This sounds like a comprehensive system," I said, maintaining my role as the compliance subject. "Walk me through how you think it would work for us." Her eyes practically sparkled as she outlined what amounted to a total surveillance state disguised as relationship enhancement, daily check-ins about every interaction, shared calendar access for all activities, joint approval required for any purchases, social plans, or professional decisions, and complete transparency of all communications, including work emails and casual conversations. "The beautiful thing," she explained, "is that when couples truly trust each other, they want this level of connection. It eliminates any possibility of misunderstandings or independent actions that might harm the relationship." Independent actions that might harm the relationship. She'd finally said the quiet part out loud. "So essentially," I said, pretending to consider her proposal seriously, "we'd be operating as a single unit, making all decisions together." "Exactly. Isn't that what true partnership means?" I nodded thoughtfully, then delivered my first piece of strategic sarcasm. "You know, it's amazing how you always find research that supports such perfectly reasonable ideas. It's like you have a gift for discovering exactly the right relationship advice at exactly the right time." The comment flew right over her head. She was so confident in her control that she took it as genuine appreciation for her thoughtfulness. "I do spend a lot of time researching ways to improve our relationship," she said proudly. "It's important to me that we have the best possible foundation." Foundation. She was still using construction metaphors for what was actually demolition work on my independence. Over the next few days, she began implementing her accountability system with the enthusiasm of someone who believed they'd achieved total victory. She wanted access to my phone, my email, my work calendar, and my location at all times. She presented each request as a natural extension of our new transparency commitment. The beauty was watching her document her own overreach. Every demand she made, every boundary she crossed, every control she tried to establish was being recorded, both by me and unknowingly by her own behavior. She was building the case against herself with every escalation. When she suggested I should probably get a new phone plan so we could share location services constantly, I agreed with just enough hesitation to make her feel like she was overcoming resistance. "I understand why that might feel strange at first," she said in her most understanding voice. "But once you experience how freeing it is to have no secrets from each other, you'll wonder why we didn't do this sooner." Freeing, she was calling total surveillance freedom. The final straw came when she presented me with what she called our relationship charter, a detailed document outlining all the rules and expectations for our new accountability system. Reading through it was like reviewing a contract for voluntary imprisonment. She'd literally written a constitution for my subjugation and expected me to sign it. As I pretended to review the document carefully, I realized this was the moment I'd been waiting for. She'd finally revealed the full scope of her intentions, not subtle manipulation anymore, but overt control disguised as mutual agreement. "This is quite comprehensive," I said, setting the document down. "You've really thought through every aspect of how this would work." "I wanted to make sure we covered everything," she replied, clearly proud of her thoroughness. "No room for misunderstandings or loopholes." "Loopholes?" She was worried about loopholes in her control system. "Before I signed this," I said, maintaining my thoughtful tone, "I'm curious about something. Where did you get the inspiration for such a detailed approach to relationship management?" The question seemed innocent enough. but I watched her face carefully as she considered how to answer. This was her chance to be honest about her research, her forums, her systematic approach to controlling me. Instead, she chose to maintain the illusion that this was all spontaneous relationship improvement. Oh, just various sources. You know how you start reading about one thing, and it leads to another. She just lied directly to my face while asking me to sign a document committing to complete honesty with her. Perfect. The manipulation expert was about to discover that her greatest success story was actually her most comprehensive failure, and unlike her slow, subtle approach, my response was going to be immediate, decisive, and absolutely final. The next morning, she presented me with an ultimatum disguised as a loving request. Either I signed her relationship charter immediately, or she'd have to reconsider whether we were truly compatible as partners. The classic manipulation move of threatening the relationship to force compliance. "I've been patient while you've adjusted to our new way of doing things," she said, her voice carrying that tone of disappointed authority that had once made me question myself. "But I need to know you're fully committed to our transparency and accountability standards." She was standing in our kitchen, holding the document like it was some kind of sacred contract, completely confident that her months of conditioning had made me dependent enough on her approval to sign away my remaining independence. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the moment when her psychological experiment would finally meet reality. "You know what?" I said, setting down my coffee and looking directly at her. "I think it's time we had a completely honest conversation about transparency and accountability." Her face brightened, clearly believing this was my surrender speech. "I'm so glad you're ready to take this step," she began, but I held up my hand. "Actually, let me share some research I've been doing myself." I walked to my briefcase and pulled out a folder containing printouts of her browser history, photos of her journal entries, screenshots of her forum posts, and documentation of every manipulation technique she'd used over the past months. Her confident expression began to shift as she recognized her own handwriting among the papers. "See, while you were busy researching how to implement total control in marriage," I said, my voice steady and calm, "I was researching what happens when someone discovers they're being treated like a psychology experiment rather than a human being." The color drained from her face as I spread the evidence across the kitchen counter, her own words, her own research, her own celebratory posts about successfully manipulating her husband. "This is fascinating reading," I continued, maintaining the same analytical tone she'd been using to document my behavior, particularly your detailed notes about behavior modification techniques and your progress reports to your online community about reshaping my personality. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For someone who'd spent months carefully crafting every conversation to maintain control, she seemed remarkably unprepared for this particular scenario. "My personal favorite," I said, picking up one of her forum posts, "is where you describe me as your long-term behavior modification project and share techniques for what you call preference transplantation and memory revision." Finally, she found her voice. "You went through my private things." That's a violation of trust. The audacity was breathtaking. After months of systematically violating every boundary I had, she was concerned about trust violations. "Trust," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. That's an interesting concept coming from someone who's been documenting my responses to manipulation like I'm a lab rat. "Tell me, what does your research say about trust in relationships?" She tried to regroup, shifting into damage control mode. "You're misunderstanding the context. Those were just theoretical discussions. I was trying to understand relationship dynamics better." "Theoretical?" I said, pulling out her journal. "Is that what you call this entry where you document how your approval withdrawal technique increased my anxiety and dependency, or this one where you celebrate, successfully isolating me from my friends?" Each piece of evidence I presented hit her like a physical blow. She was watching her entire psychological project collapse in real time. "You were manipulating me systematically," I continued, documenting my responses, sharing your methods with other women online, and planning to escalate to financial control and career sabotage, all while pretending this was about improving our relationship. She tried one last manipulation technique, shifting to victim mode. "I was trying to help us become closer. Everything I did was because I love you." "No," I said firmly. "Everything you did was because you wanted to control me. Love doesn't require behavior modification experiments. Love doesn't involve treating your partner like a subject to be studied and reshaped." I picked up her relationship charter and held it between us. "This document you want me to sign, it's not about accountability or transparency. It's the final phase of your control project, total surveillance disguised as mutual trust." She was desperate now, cycling through every technique in her playbook, gaslighting attempts about how I was overreacting, guilt trips about how much effort she'd put into improving our relationship, and appeals to my love for her and our shared history. But here's the thing about discovering the mechanics of manipulation. Once you understand how it works, it becomes powerless against you. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally reclaimed his own power. You're going to listen while I explain exactly what the consequences of your little psychology experiment are going to be. I had her complete attention now. The manipulator was finally face to face with someone who refused to be manipulated. You wanted to implement total control in our marriage, I continued. Instead, you're about to learn what total loss of control looks like. Because unlike your slow, subtle approach to destroying someone's independence, my response is going to be immediate and absolute. She stood frozen, still holding her worthless relationship charter, finally understanding that her experimental subject had not only escaped the lab, but was about to burn it down entirely. The student had graduated, and the final exam was about to begin. I pulled out the final folder from my briefcase, the one containing documents she'd never seen coming. Bank statements for my separate account, legal paperwork already filed, asset documentation that my attorney had helped me prepare, evidence that while she was playing psychologist, I was playing chess. While you were busy implementing your behavior modification project, I said, laying out the papers with methodical precision, I was implementing something much more effective: complete financial independence, legal protection, and documentation of every manipulation attempt you've made over the past months. Her eyes darted between the documents, finally understanding that her experimental subject had been conducting his own experiment. The difference was, mine had a clear endpoint. You wanted total control, I continued, so let me show you what someone with actual control looks like. I've already moved my finances out of your reach. I've already consulted with legal counsel about your psychological manipulation tactics. I've already documented everything you've done to try to reshape my identity and isolate me from my support network. She tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. The beautiful irony is that your own research provided the evidence I needed: your journals, your forum posts, your detailed documentation of manipulation techniques. You built the entire case against yourself, while thinking you were building a case study of successful behavior modification. I picked up her relationship charter and held it out to her. You know what this document really represents? It's not a relationship agreement. It's a confession. Written proof that you wanted to establish total surveillance and control over another human being. The paper shook in her hands as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. Here's what your psychology research failed to teach you, I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd reclaimed complete control of his own life. The difference between influence and manipulation is consent. The difference between partnership and control is respect, and the difference between love and possession is freedom. She finally found her voice, but it came out as a whisper. What are you saying? I'm saying your experiment is over. Your subject is removing himself from the study permanently. I walked to the closet and pulled out the suitcase I'd packed the night before. Her eyes widened as she realized this wasn't just a confrontation about her behavior. This was my exit strategy. You can't just leave, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. We can work through this. I can change. Change? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You spent months systematically breaking down my independence, documenting my responses like I was a test animal, and sharing your manipulation techniques with strangers online. The only thing you want to change is that you got caught. I headed toward the door, then turned back for one final observation. You know what's really fascinating about your research project? You studied every aspect of psychological manipulation, except the most important one. You never researched what happens when your subject discovers what you're doing and decides to demonstrate what real power looks like. She followed me to the door, cycling through every technique in her manipulation playbook one last time: promises of change, appeals to our history, threats about what I'd be losing, and guilt trips about abandoning our relationship. But here's the thing about true independence. Once you've reclaimed it, manipulation attempts sound like static on a broken radio. Wait, she called out as I reached my car. You can't just throw away everything we built together. I turned around one final time, and this moment felt like the most important lesson I could leave her with. We didn't build anything together. You built a control system and tried to install me as the central component. The difference is I'm not a component to be managed. I'm a person who deserves respect, not psychological manipulation. I got in my car and started the engine, watching through the windshield as she stood in our doorway, still holding her relationship charter. The document that was supposed to formalize her total control over my life had become the symbol of her total failure. As I drove away, I thought about the men in her online forums who were probably still unknowingly subjected to similar experiments. Maybe some of them would eventually discover what was happening and find their own strength to resist. Maybe others would remain permanent test subjects in their wives' psychological laboratories. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My problem had been allowing someone to treat me like a project instead of a partner. That problem was now permanently solved. 3 months later, I received a message through my attorney. She wanted to discuss reconciliation and was willing to compromise on some of her relationship requirements. The message came with an attachment that was essentially a revised version of her relationship charter, with slightly less invasive control mechanisms. I didn't respond. Some people never learn that the problem wasn't the specific terms of their control system. The problem was believing they had the right to implement a control system at all. I'd learned something valuable from her experiment, though. I'd learned exactly what manipulation looks like when someone thinks they're being subtle. I'd learned to recognize psychological manipulation techniques before they could take root. Most importantly, I'd learned that real strength isn't about controlling other people. It's about refusing to be controlled. She'd Googled how to implement total control in marriage. I'd implemented something much more powerful. Total freedom from anyone who thinks love requires surrendering your autonomy. Turns out the best response to someone trying to make you smaller is to remind them that you're not their experiment to conduct. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.